What I hope you'll see from these examples is that EQ is not a one-size-fits-all solution to working effectively with others. As Sean mentioned before, there are 4 general components to Goleman's model. The first 2, self-awareness and self-management, are personal competencies. They determine how well people manage themselves. The final 2, social awareness and relationship management, are social competencies. They determine how well people manage relationships. Self-awareness means having a clear understanding of one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, drives, and capabilities. On the surface, this is really nothing new. It's been touted for thousands of years. But it's a critical skill, and as Sean mentioned, it's overlooked by many people. It's so important because people with a high degree of self-awareness recognize how their feelings and values affect them, and this relates to how they interact with others in a behavioral way. These people tend to be very thoughtful in the sense that they take time to think about the things that are important to them and how their work and lives relate to those things. This self-reflection helps them to be aware of both their limitations and strengths, and they're candid about this with others. As an example of this skill, think about a leader who is by nature open with his feelings. He's the type of person who wears his emotions on his sleeve, and he doesn't hesitate to let people know how he's feeling. Just imagine that he's made a decision that turned out to be a bad call. It's had some serious repercussions for the company, and he's called a meeting with his team to discuss the matter. Instead of being defensive about his decision or trying to deflect blame for it, he begins the meeting by taking personal responsibility. He tells his staff that one of his weaknesses is that he gets excited about new projects without taking important details into account, and that because of this he rushed into making a decision without taking the time to consider all the ramifications. He then goes on to get his team's input on things that they can do to mitigate the problem. This is the type of scenario that most EQ researchers would use as an example of a leader who has good self-awareness, and to be sure, some people on his team would agree. But would all people on his team necessarily view this manager as acting with high EQ? They might appreciate that he took responsibility for his mistake, but some people in the room might think that a person who rushes into decisions without getting all the necessary facts doesn't have good self-awareness at all. In fact, they might say that this is a leader who only developed self-awareness when it was too late, or worse, he's a leader who's only attempting to cover for his mistake by appealing to his staff's emotions. The point I'm trying to make is that a person can behave with what he thinks is high EQ, and he can be sincere in his behavior and feelings, but our behavior is always interpreted by other people, and these interpretations are different for people who have different behavioral styles. While some people would respond very positively to this leader, there are others who would be less impressed and who might even be disappointed by his actions. Likewise, the ways that we ourselves display EQ behaviors are influenced by our own styles. In the example I just gave, if the leader was by nature a more reserved or emotionally controlled person, how he handled this situation would look much different. If he had high EQ and self-awareness, he would still communicate his mistake to the team and take responsibility for it, but he would probably do it in a less personal and outwardly emotional way. And once again, this would have ramifications for how people on his team interpreted his behavior.
Casey, thanks so much for that information. I've got a real practical question for you. It seems like even though I'm a manager that's working hard to display emotional intelligence, and clearly I've taken the work to do so in the example that you gave, what I'm seeing is that different people might not get the response to that I was hoping for. So as a manager, what am I supposed to do?
That's really the fundamental question, isn't it? And it gets back to the old saying that you can't please all the people all the time. So even managers and leaders who have great emotional intelligence skills won't be successful all the time or in all different situations. But what they can do is try to assess, even ahead of time, the situation and the best and most effective leadership style for that situation. And leaders who have IEQ tend to be pretty gifted at this. They can assess situations and decide what are the best actions to take, what are the best things to do to help people to have the kind of responses that they want. Another thing they can do is determine the behavioral styles of the people that they're talking to, the people on their team or the audience, and they can adapt their behavior somewhat to appeal to those different styles. Now, like I said before, you can't please all the people all the time, but what you can do is your best. And even afterwards, after a situation, you can follow up with specific individuals one-on-one, knowing that they may need a little bit different information and input from you.
Okay, Casey, then, so what you're saying is that as a manager, if I take into account different behavioral styles as well as emotional intelligence, I can actually have that best group interaction in the example that you gave. And by understanding that different people might have different reactions to that display of emotional intelligence, I can account for those behavioral styles and circle back with them after the fact. Therefore, I'm able to actually get the best message out to the entire group and to get the overall result that I'm after.
That's right, David. So let's move on to the second aspect of emotional intelligence called self-management. Goleman says that self-management frees us from being prisoners to our own emotions. Without understanding what we're feeling, we can't control our feelings, and this leaves us at the mercy of our emotions. This is okay when it comes to positive emotions like enthusiasm or success, but it's a problem if we're controlled by negative emotions like frustration or anxiety. People with this mastery are usually optimistic, upbeat, and enthusiastic. This is particularly important in the workplace because emotions are literally contagious. As an example, think about a manager who is usually optimistic and happy at work, but she's also a pretty subdued type of person. She isn't the type who smiles a lot or shows a great deal of obvious enthusiasm. Instead, she shows her excitement and optimism in less obvious ways. For example, she writes emails to individuals complimenting them on their work instead of calling it out in a more public forum. So she's more private in the way she shows her optimism. She's straightforward and clear in the way she communicates, but she isn't the type of person who feels it's necessary to communicate very often, so she limits the amount of interactions that she has with her staff. Now, this leader is optimistic. She feels upbeat. If you were to ask her if she feels enthusiastic, she would say yes. She would also say that she's transparent in her interactions. But would her behavior correspond to what you read about in some of the EQ books when they describe things like optimism and transparency? Would her team describe her as off the charts in the way she shows enthusiasm? It's likely that some would not, while others would be perfectly happy with the way she displays these skills. Just like in the previous example, the point here is that our behavioral styles are very ingrained in who we are. This is why our behavior is predictable, because we become comfortable in so many of our routine behaviors. Learning how to be more emotionally intelligent is important, and there's good evidence that it can be done with success, but it's important to recognize that people of different styles will show EQ in their own unique ways, and also people will interpret their EQ behavior in their own unique ways. Let's go on to the third component of Goleman's model, social awareness. This is mostly about empathy. It's the ability to read another person's facial expressions, voice, and nonverbal signals in order to understand that person's emotions. This is especially important for leaders because by staying attuned to how people are feeling, they can say and do what is most appropriate. For example, they can try to calm people's fears, lessen anger, or in a more positive example, just have a good time at the office party.